countries more recently, and also growth tragedies, right? So we're going to build on a sort of a more coherent framework in order for us to be able to deal with these issues a little bit more easier, right? Because a lot of these things are going to keep on reappearing through our course. So ultimate question is what causes economic growth? And there are the fundamental causes or the underlying causes of economic growth, like institutions, culture, geography, and all these things matter. All these things matter because they indirectly impact economic growth through the so-called proximate sources of economic growth, which are human capital, physical capital, and total factor productivity, right? So human and physical capital, and economists have an obsession about calling things capital, right? The total factor productivity is something a little bit different. Right, so I mean, last week, when we discussed the Industrial Revolution in class and in the lecture, we mentioned some of these fundamental causes of economic growth. Right, so for example, the Bob Allen explanation is about coal. Essentially, it is a geographical explanation. Right, the explanation by Joel Mokyr is basically focuses on culture. Right, and this explanation on institutions, security, property rights, well, that's also a distinct fundamental source of economic growth. So today we're going to begin with the proximate sources of economic growth, and then we're going to go into the fundamental sources of economic growth. So, I mean, if you have a macroeconomics course, or if you're going to have sort of a a little bit more intense macroeconomics course, more detailed, you will probably have a section on economic growth, and in macroeconomics you would basically deal with these aspects of economic growth. So human capital, physical capital, and total factor productivity, which are proximate sources of economic growth. Economic historians are more interested into the fundamental sources of economic growth, like institutions, culture, and geography, because these factors have very deep historical roots, right? These things have very deep historical roots, and in a way, economic historians have a comparative advantage in analyzing these things. Okay, so let us begin. So the first source of economic growth is physical capital. And this is sort of the most basic one. And physical capital is, all the equipment and structures in a given economy in a given period of time. Right? So this means, equipment is the tables you're using, the chairs you're sitting on, the laptops you have in front of you, so on and so forth. The structure is this, university itself, right? So when we talked about, GDP, estimating GDP for university, equipment would be, the laptops you're using, the tables you're using, and the structures will be something like the building itself, right? So these are the two components of economic growth. So the question is, to kind of put this in a big, kind of greater perspective. I mean, this is I'm going to talk about a steel mill in the Soviet Union constructed in the interwar periods between, the First World War and the Second World War. It was the largest steel mill in the world at the time, having, employing tens of thousands of workers. This is basically how economic growth on the basis of physical capital pretty much looks like, right? You have a giant factory here emanating all the pollution in this case, so these are structures, and this is equipment, right? You have something here on the railroad, some sort of railway lines or whatever it is, right? So this is a prime example. Soviet Union is a prime example of a country growing almost exclusively on the basis of physical capital. Right? So the main source of economic growth in the Soviet Union was pretty much physical capital, and we're going to have a whole topic on that, which is going to be week 7 or 8 or something, right? You can see in this graph here, plotting investment as a proportion of GDP and real GDP per capita, that there's a, more or less a pretty clear relationship between investment and GDP per capita. In the sense that countries that have lower investment shares here typically experience a lower economic growth. Right? So I mean, the United States is obviously much richer than China, but the United States is growing at a much slower rate because it is investing a much lower share of its GDP. So it's investing about 15 to 20% of GDP, experiencing a GDP growth rate of about 2%, while China, for example, is investing between 40 and 45% of GDP, and in this period of the 2000s experiencing economic growth rates in excess of 10%. Right? So these are freakishly high investment rates. So this means that an average Chinese during this period of time invested about 50 cents of each euro that Chinese earn. Yeah, go ahead.
We understand that physical capital is only things that are tangible.
Pretty much, pretty much.
And like metals and structures are not so important.
Metals.
Like methods of production and stuff.
So physical capital is, one factor of production. Method of production is something different. Method of production is about total factor productivity. And we're going to talk about that. So physical capital is just one source of economic growth. And you can see on the basis of this source of economic growth, this probably to a large extent explains Chinese freakishly high economic growth rates, right? So it's one of the reasons why China is going to freakishly high rate is precisely because it is investing a freakishly high amount of its GDP. So the question is, how do you increase something like physical capital? So the first thing is something that I already mentioned, right? So one way at the very basic level, you can increase investment for increasing the domestic savings rate, right? So you can increase investment and hence economic growth through simply saving more, right? So you can see that one of the sources and causes of economic growth, if you're a policymaker, you want to increase economic growth rate, you want to basically then increase the domestic savings rate. And this is essentially what the Chinese are doing. Another way of doing that is not necessarily increasing the domestic savings rate, so it's not something, that you should save more. You essentially allow other countries to invest on your behalf in a way, to save on your behalf by importing investment, which is foreign direct investment, right? So this is another way you can achieve it. So instead of saving yourselves, you basically allow other countries to save on your behalf, right? So this is something that is particularly characterizing Eastern Europe, right? Foreign direct investment is pretty large share of investment in Eastern Europe in general. The ultimate question here is, can, for example, taking the case of China as sort of here an outlier, can China grow indefinitely on the basis of investment? Right? Can China grow indefinitely on the basis of investment? And the answer is no, right? The answer is no, because, each unit of investment, each additional dollar of investment brings diminishing returns, right? It brings diminishing returns, like in the sense that, for example, building a railway line between, say, Shanghai and Beijing, the very first one, is extremely productive, right? This is going to boost economic growth to a great extent, right? You can build a second railway line, which is going to be useful, to allow maybe bigger traffic or something like that, but it's not going to be as useful as the first one. And if you build a third one, that third one might be utterly useless, right? Unneeded. So each unit of investment, as you progressively invest more and more and more, brings a lower and lower and lower return, right? Brings correspondingly diminishing returns. Question is, right? So you can theoretically sort of basically productivity on investment in China is decreasing, let's put it that way. So one way to alleviate that problem is, for example, just to focus on China, right? I'm just taking this as an example, is for China to actually start progressively then investing more and more and more and more and more and more, right? So each unit of investment is becoming progressively less productive, but they sort of overcome this problem by simply dumping even more money. Right? So this is sort of a theoretical possibility. Question is this, right? Can you then increase investment rates to such a great extent to sort of, ensure economic growth continues into the future? And the answer is obviously no. Right? There's a natural limit, and the limit how much you can increase investment as part of your GDP is obviously not more than 100%. Right? And even if you boost the investment rate to say 100% of GDP somewhere here, obviously this would imply that nobody in the economy is consuming anything, right? So people would starve. Right? So this is probably not something that is this is not sort of a viable policy-making option, right? So this is basically not an option. After a certain point, you can't really boost savings rate, right? Because you want to consume. You want to consume. A viable alternative is then actually to just sort of, rely on foreign direct investment more. This is a viable alternative, but for example, we know in Eastern Europe, particularly in countries like Poland and Czech Republic, there is a sort of a backlash against foreign direct investment, right? In the sense of motivating economic populism, right? So many residents of Eastern Europe are concerned that basically, foreigners are owning the most productive manufacturing facilities, are actually extracting huge dividends from this and then shipping this to Germany. Right, so there's sort of an extraction of wealth, and politically this is probably, there's probably a limit to how much foreign direct investment any country can sort of, handle. So physical capital is a very important source of economic growth. There are limits to it, right? There are limits to it how much you can grow just on the basis of physical capital. And the question is whether there is an alternative. And one alternative is human capital. And human capital is an alternative, so instead of just kind of producing more physical stuff, right? Rather than just producing more physical stuff, you can actually invest into yourself. Right? So human capital is essentially how we typically measure it. I mean, this is the quality of the labor force, but we usually measure it through education and health. Right? So we had this class discussion about, what is sort of the purpose of education, which is about signaling, your underlying quality or increasing your productivity, but ultimately we do know as an empirical fact that education does lift the productivity of the population, right, or the workforce. So one way then to stimulate economic growth is to invest into the education of the labor force and also to invest into the health of the education, right? Then the question is, before we move into that, this is, to kind of make this very obvious, this is a very obvious example of, prime human capital institutions, so guys, aim big for your MSc or PhD or something like that, right? Target the best. In any case, this is the relationship between education, measured here by years of schooling, and economic growth. And actually, the relationship, when I showed you for investment and economic growth, was a little bit more fuzzier. This relationship is much more clear-cut. Right? Each dot represents a country, years of schooling as a measure of human capital. And in this case, each country is expressed, its labor productivity, so GDP per worker, not by population, is expressed relative to the United States. And you can see here very clearly, the countries that are very poorly educated, like for example Nigeria or Mali, are also the countries that are far below the labor productivity level of the United States here, right? The United States is one of the most productive countries in the world precisely because it is so well educated, right? So an average American means this is something like between 13 and 14 years of schooling. So this means an average American has about completed high school and 1 or 2 years of college. So this is how you would interpret these numbers. Spain is, for example, here just sort of as a digression. Spain is a very interesting case, right? So Spain is pretty much at the labor productivity line of the United States. Right? So Spain is at the labor productivity line of the United States. Well, obviously, Spain is a much more poorer economy than the United States. So this means that an average Spanish worker is as productive as the American worker, but the reason why Spain is poorer than the United States is because there aren't many people working in the first place. Right? So this is one of the reasons why Spain is sort of a much lower level of income per capita than the United States. But ultimately here you can see a very clear relationship between education and labor productivity. So the ultimate question is, from a policy-making perspective, how do you increase human capital? How do you increase the quality of your workforce? So from a policy-making perspective, right, one way to increase the human capital of the population is, for example, building schools, subsidize education. Subsidize education, you provide tuition waivers on university, you make elementary and secondary school free, and so on and so forth. Build hospital and also subsidize health that promotes sports, no smoking, and so on and so forth. Right? So I'm a chain smoker, but a chain smoker. So human capital, economists tend to believe that the government has a much bigger role to play in stimulating human capital than when it comes to stimulating physical capital, right? Because human capital is essentially a public good, which involves externalities, right? So for example, the private benefits of education and the private benefits of health are lower than what the social benefits of education are and the social benefits of health are. So to give you a silly example, maybe there's this insane movement towards anti-vaccination of children happening in Europe as well, unfortunately, more so in the States. If you don't vaccinate your kid, this is obviously going to damage the health of that kid, but that kid is more likely to get diseases and transmit that diseases to other people, right? Creating negative externalities. So if you're a government, you want to ensure these kind of things don't happen, right? So health and education have positive externalities, and hence, we believe there is a stronger role for public policy to play in terms of stimulating human capital than in terms of stimulating physical capital, right? The question is, Can you grow indefinitely on the basis of just increasing human capital? Can you grow indefinitely just on the basis of permanently increasing education and permanently increasing the health of your workforce? Right? I mean, for education, the answer is no, right? You cannot permanently increase your education. So at a very, basic example, maybe, just maybe, it makes sense to do a PhD. 2 PhDs probably doesn't make sense. 3 PhDs probably really doesn't make sense. I mean, theoretically, maybe you can do 4 or 5 PhDs in your life because, you're limited by your lifetime, but this really doesn't make sense. Right? So there are limits to how much you can boost the education, how much you can boost the average years of schooling of your population. Also, when it comes to health, I mean, we know that, lifetime expectancy has been increasing consistently over the past 200 years. And now on a decade basis, each decade life expectancy increases by maybe 1 or 2 years in developed economies. But there are probably, some sort of biological limits, right? So, I mean, maybe we do live, until we're 1,000 years old, but this is going to happen in the very distant future, if it even happens, right? So there are also probably limits to how much you can increase the health of your workforce. Then we are left with the final source of economic growth, which is total factor productivity. And total factor productivity is, methods of production to some extent. It is the efficiency with which we use physical capital and human capital to produce economic growth. Right? So it's not obviously what matters. For example, you're studying. It doesn't only matter how much, laptops you use to study and how much effort you put into studying. It matters how efficient you are in using the time and the energy you're investing. This is ultimately what total factor productivity is, right? Physical capital and human capital matter, but what matters more is how you use them combined, how you combine them actually to produce economic growth. And this is what total factor productivity is about. So we know nowadays, from empirical exercises, that the primary reason, why some countries grow fast, some grow slowly, and so on and so forth, is overwhelmingly due to total factor productivity, right? So total factor productivity is driving, total factor productivity is driving most of this variation in economic growth rates, right? So China does invest more than the United States, and it's the reason why China is growing faster. But the main reason why actually China is growing faster because it's becoming more efficient. That is the main reason, right? Next to that, right, so total factor productivity can account for most of the variation in economic growth rates around the world. We also know that, total factor productivity is responsible for most of income differences between countries nowadays, right? So we know that empirical exercises tend to show that about, between 50 and say 70% of income differences between countries in the world are mostly driven by total factor productivity. So how efficient you are in using physical and human capital to produce economic growth, right? To produce output, essentially. We're gonna put some meat, behind the substance to sort of, illuminate a little bit further what this means. So this would be an example of extremely bad, method of production, right? I should suggest it before. So this is a case, of an Indian factory. And this Indian factory, and you can see from these pictures, is characterized by very low efficiency. Right? You have here some sort of machine which is covered in mud for whatever reason. It is covered in mud. Right? So this machine, although you have some kind of physical capital here, it probably can't run at 100% capacity because it is very poorly maintained. And this is going to damage the efficiency of physical capital and hence economic growth. Right? Here, I don't know how well you can see, but for example, here we have some kind of random tools on the floor of the factory, right? So if you're a worker, you want to operate this machine, but you have to go through here, you might trip over these hammers and break your head, right? So this is not going to increase your efficiency, it is going to damage it tremendously, right? This is an example, how a factory with very high TFP looks like, right? So don't confuse this, with the fancy cars. I mean, this to an extent is physical capital, right? It's kind of like with the pretty surroundings. I mean, just kind of look at the layout of this, right? It looks very neat, it looks very ordered, it's well lighted, there are no tools here, so this person presumably won't trip over and break his head, which is going to increase his efficiency. Right? So efficiency to an extent is just kind of keeping things well ordered to an extent. Now, let's be more specific about it. It's essentially there are two components of total effective productivity. One is technology and the other is efficiency. So I'm talking about efficiency, but the first and foremost component of total effective productivity is technology, right? Technology. So ultimately how you boost the efficiency is through boosting technology also to an extent, right? So it only doesn't matter that you have a laptop which is hardware, but what kind of applications you have inside. To an extent you can kind of think about this in terms of technology, right? So for developed economies, main source of technology is innovation, the process of innovation, right? And in modern economies, and really in developed economies, think about the United States, it is primarily the outcome of basic research, which is mostly done in universities or in research institutes, and this is the process of invention. Right? So think about CERN and sort of the very big ideas that are coming, right? Higgs boson and so on and so forth. This is basic research. It is completely unclear whether this is going to have any sort of commercial use, but it is basic research, right? They're creating the ideas. Then the commercial companies are essentially using this basic research and the process of invention to commercialize it, right? And this is the process of research and development. This is the process of invention. This is the process of innovation. And innovation is essentially putting ideas to a commercial practice, which is ultimately going to increase the output of an economy and hence economic growth. So, I mean, there's sort of, we don't know really how much, but majority of economists, at least dealing with this topic of economic growth and technology, would agree there is a role for public policy here. Right, primarily in terms of patents and subsidies, right? So for example, if you're a commercial firm investing billions of dollars into trying to find, a cure for cancer, you probably do want to ensure that that company will have a patent on this cure for cancer. Otherwise, it won't really have an incentive to invest so much money into finding a cure, right? Because this type of research involves huge expenditure. And you probably want to ensure that then hence, some other company who hasn't invested a penny just copies this technology and starts, producing it. So you probably do want to give some sort of, you would say, monopoly rights to companies that are engaging in the process of innovation. The question is, how far should you go? And also subsidies, like tax credits for engaging in the process of research and development as well as basic research. So this holds for developed economies. Right, so for developed economies, they primarily grow on the basis of innovating. For developing economies, it probably doesn't really make sense to innovate. For developing economies, it probably makes more sense to imitate and copy technologies, right? It is sort of, cheaper, to copy an iPhone rather than to invent an iPhone, right? And this is essential, for example, something that Chinese companies have done like Huawei. First and foremost. So it pretty much, in the first stage copied iPhone, but then obviously added more innovations and it started growing as a company. So for developing countries, which, first of all, most, don't have much scientists, don't have much engineers, probably makes more sense to copy technologies rather than to innovate, right? Here, foreign direct investment in important technology is hence key. And, you can think about there's an underlying tension. There's an underlying tension here between developed economies and developing technologies. Because developed economies, they want to protect their technology. Right? They want to protect companies like Apple, Google, whatever. Right? Developing economies just want to copy this technology. And the question is, what do you do sort of, in the real world? And this is, something that America and China nowadays are engaging in, this trade war, which is also largely based around the issue of patents and subsidies, right? So Americans and the American companies want the Chinese to enforce patent rights more strongly, right? And this is an underlying source also of political tension. So things, kind of spill out from just purely economic arena into politics. So another aspect, another dimension of economic growth is efficiency. Efficiency more explicitly, right? So efficiency is about using your existing capital and technology better. So, yes, your second degree is business administration, right? So, this is basically all about your degree to an extent, right? Business administration to an extent, is about management. So managing physical and human capital to increase efficiency. This is all about managerial quality. This is ultimately what managers do. They combine human and physical capital to increase the profits of their company, and if this is caused by an increase in efficiency, this is also ultimately going to lead to an increase in economic growth, right? Think about here, sort of also McKinsey, Bain and Company, this kind of people. They're all about increasing the managerial quality of companies, right? Another way to increase efficiency is through increasing trade and sort of decreasing protectionist barriers, right? And this is why economists are sort of extremely positive about the effects of trade, right? And sort of globalization. We're going to talk about this, to a great extent next week. So one way to increase efficiency is for increasing foreign trade, for making your economy more open. By making your economy more open, you expose your domestic firms to foreign competition. So some companies might collapse because they're inefficient, but the survivors are going to be stronger. Right? The survivors are going to be stronger because they will have to increase their efficiency level in order to survive in this sort of more crueler world, which is then going to lead to an aggregate efficiency of the overall economy, boosting economic growth. Another way to increase competition is for engaging in domestic market competition policies. So this would be something like decreasing entry barriers to markets, decreasing exit barriers to market, essentially about deregulation the economy to a large extent, right? So ultimately, as I was talking about, growth on the basis of physical and human capital is limited, right? Total effective productivity, we tend to believe, is the key to long-run economic growth. Because theoretically, there's no limit to the amount of ideas that are out there. Right? There's theoretically, no obvious reason why there should be a limited amount of technologies and ideas out there that haven't been sort of fished out yet. Nevertheless, to kind of give you a more pessimistic viewpoint, we ultimately do not know what is going to happen, but there are some economists who believe that TFP is becoming increasingly more difficult to obtain and seize, in the sense that technologies are becoming increasingly more difficult to find out, right? In a way that, inventing fire was sort of much easier than inventing an iPhone. So some economists believe that, right? How things will play out, ultimately we do not know, but as sort of historical evidence, we know that at least over the past 200 years, TFP growth rate has been extremely consistent and extremely stable. So we don't see a slowdown in total effective productivity growth over the past 200 years, right? So we don't see the data, although, yeah, things might go, it might take a very bad turn, but we don't know ultimately. Let's hope not. Right, so let's move to the fundamental sources of economic growth. Sort of, the more interesting stuff and stuff that we're more interested in as economic historians. So one of the fundamental sources of economic growth are institutions, right? And institutions matter because they shape the incentives of you as individuals and as companies to invest into human capital, physical capital, and technology, right? So this is why institutions matter. And here you can see one type of institution, right? Institutions are difficult to measure, but sometimes you can try to measure them. So this is here measured average protection against risk of expropriation. So the higher is this, basically it means that you're less likely to be maybe, expropriated by the government. Or say, here you invest some money, you build a manufacturing company, there's an extremely high risk that you will get expropriated, meaning that, the government might nationalize the facility, the factory you have built. Right? And the government might nationalize, the facility you have built. Obviously, it's going to decrease your incentive to save and decrease your incentive to invest, right? Because then your saving and investment is going to be extremely uncertain. And if that's the case, obviously, as an economy, you're going to achieve a lower rate of economic growth. And if it is vice versa, you're going to achieve a higher rate of economic growth. So there's a super nice historical example of this. It's coming now. I don't know if it is out yet, but it is coming in the American Economic Review. So there's this case of, Germans after World War II, they were basically expelled from Eastern Europe, right? So there was lots of Germans, ethnic Germans in Czech Republic, Poland, Yugoslavia, so on and so forth. And after World War II, they were expelled because they were thought to be Nazis, and a lot of them were, let's be honest, right? There is a research that tracks these Germans who were expelled from Eastern Europe and looks at the incentives and sort of habits of not only them who were then, in the 40s and 50s, but of their children and grandchildren, habits in terms of investing into education versus investing into physical capital. And basically what this paper is about is arguing that the children and grandchildren of these people who were expelled from Eastern Europe and everything they owned was nationalized, now have a much greater tendency to invest more into their education. Right, so these are Germans who fled to Germany, and these Germans who were expelled from Eastern Europe have a much greater tendency to invest nowadays into their education versus investing into housing. Right, so institutions essentially shape their incentives to invest into education versus, say, into houses. Right, so there's this massive traumatic shock, right? It makes sense, right? If you have this kind of in your family memory, if you have this experience of the government basically taking everything you own, then you will probably try to save and invest into the more intangible stuff, like education, which the government or whoever else, can't steal or destroy, right? So even, after 60, 70 years, these kind of institutions shaped essentially the culture of these people and the culture of their descendants, right? So you can also see the importance of institutions in terms of corruption and in terms of economic growth. I mean, corruption is essentially a byproduct of bad institutions, right? Of non-existence of rule of law and so on and so forth. Right? So this is sort of a counterintuitive, but here a lower level of this index implies more corruption, and a higher level of this index implies less corruption. Very unsurprisingly, you can see that countries that are more corrupt have typically much lower economic growth rates. No, this is the Human Development Index. Sorry, right? They're much less developed than countries that are, less corrupt. Countries that are less corrupt tend to be much more developed, right? So we also know nowadays that, regulation, sort of excessive amount of regulation tends to be associated with a high degree of corruption, right? Excessive amount of regulation tends to be associated with a very high degree of corruption. So these economies here tend to be characterized by extreme degree of regulation. And the rationale behind it is very simple, right? The more regulation there is, the more, permits or approvals from the government you need in order to do something, you're probably more likely to encounter corruption, right? Some bureaucrat is probably more likely to ask for extraction of money, right? If that person has more opportunities to do so, right? And for example, where is India? India is probably somewhere here. Yeah, India is here, right? Highly corrupt economy. So for India, we know, as a historical fact that, throughout the 19th and 20th century, for example, in the case of India, it was so extremely regulated that, literally, if this was a manufacturing company, this was a desk, and if I wanted to move this desk to that part of the room, you would need to ask for a government permit to do that. Right? The government permit just to move literally one desk from one side of the room to another. And you can imagine this was extremely conducive to corruption, right? If you need to wait for approval for this, you might try to speed it up, or the bureaucrat might try to extract some money in order for him or her to allow it, right? The importance of institutions is sort of most clearly visible in the case of North and South Korea, right? Clearly visible from outer space, right? So this is the satellite image taken of North Korea and South Korea, and this is, this is the lights here. These are lights, right? So these are the lights, and basically this is a very good proxy for the intensity of economic activity, right? Lights tend to be a good proxy for the intensity of economic activity. North Korea and South Korea, is an extremely interesting scenario when it comes to the importance of institutions because, before the Korean Civil War, there were one unified country. There were one country, extremely similar geography, culture was identical, right? So geography, it was pretty much similar between North and South Korea, culture was identical. For that matter, right, North Korea, which was then taken over by the communists, and South Korea by, market institutions were developed there. For that matter, before the separation of Korea into North and South Korea, North Korea was a little bit richer, actually, than South Korea. Right? It was a little bit richer, and this also explains why the communists took power in North Korea because there were some manufacturing companies there. There was some sort of working class to support the Communist Party. Right here, I mean, socialist regime, a command economy was installed here, a market-based economy was installed here, and you can see all the difference in the world, right? South Korea is shining, North Korea is in utter darkness, right? Only there is one piece of light here, which is Pyongyang, which may or may not be, the palace of Kim Jong-un, right? Or something like that. Okay, so let's continue on after we take a break of 10 minutes. So let's take a break until 6:50.